I think you mentioned Duquesne with the upset. I think that's a good segue into some of just the potential upsets that we're kind of eyeing right now, just based off of recent brackets put out by ESPN for with their bracketology. Just some of the ones that we've been eyeing. So, I mean, just off the top, I think you always have to look at the 5 and 12 games. One that definitely sticks out to me is Maryland. Which ESPN bracketology has Drake playing Maryland right now, and they're late. They're playing
Ooh,
last week.
I
That
would
is
say
definitely a game that I think Maryland drops. Honestly,
I know, and while Maryland has been a great squad, they've been, I would say, underlooked. I still feel like the team doesn't fit the role of a top seed. They
right?
have been great. But it's more or less on the lack of solid quality wins. They've been
Yeah,
consistent with winning games, but they typically haven't shown incredibly good wins. I should say
I
they
I
don't
think
have
Maryland is, like
solid
you
wins.
mentioned, been underlooked, but they've also been untested, like you just mentioned.
Mention exactly, and I think another team that kind of fits that role a little bit is Marquette. They haven't
Right.
exactly had the biggest wins. Once again, that's more or less on the Big East with their faults, but I think overall they have an opportunity to be upset in the first round. And I know Shaka Smart typically doesn't have that downside to him, but this year feels very off from typical years at Marquette. They feel like
Right.
another 5 to 12 upset, and 12 seeds are really turning into be the big issue. I mean, that can be a VCU, that can be a Yale, that can be a slew once again of the teams we've just mentioned. And I think that all these teams could be favored, and maybe should be favored over a Marquette or a Maryland for reference.
In terms of another, I could see Texas A&M getting upset. ESPN has them as a 3 seed. I could definitely see them ending up getting upset if they get a draw with one of those mid-major schools we just talked about. That's a team that, like we just mentioned, is one of the colder teams in the country right now. I understand the 2 games they lost were two unranked. I mean, not by mistake, ranked teams, but just their showings in that game in those games hasn't really necessarily helped their case.
No, definitely. I mean, I do think that once again, and we say this every year, there's always really good teams that just lose games we never expected. Think Auburn, think Purdue, think just once again, a ton of teams. And there's always like a 15-2. Like, I think it's very rough to predict these games, and it's why so few people get them when they fill out their brackets. But you always got to throw out these names because there are just small weaknesses that will appear and they'll flash by your eye and you won't even think about them. And I think that this year is one of the harder years as well because we've seen some really good programs. I think the top 15 to 20 teams are some of the best teams we've seen as of recent, if not, in my time looking at college basketball, which hasn't been that long, but it's been pretty much most of the 2020s. But at the same time, we're looking at some really good mid-major teams. So it's hard to really fight on who's the better one, and you never really know until it happens.
Right.
I will say though, and I know last year was the first year we didn't have a 15-2 upset for like 3 years. I think we're going back to that,
I think we
and
will
I
too.
think I have my choice of team to be upset. I would say at least I don't really know what the 15 seed would be at the moment, but
Um, I don't know if we're on the same wavelength here. Are you thinking Wisconsin?
I'm thinking Wisconsin
Yeah.
definitely. I mean, don't get me wrong; they've been great. Tanji's done well. I mean,
Right.
guards once again done some magical work on his part, but Wisconsin feels rough. They're a little bit like last year where they did get upset in the first round by JMU. I know that team was more of a team that fell off. Like once again, they were very strong to start, but then Big Ten play kind of pushed them into this colder, lower seeded spot that was kind of ignored, and then they eventually lost because of that scenario. I don't think it's the same reason once again, but I feel like the team is being very overrated. They have their moments, but at the same time, they've had just bad losses. I mean, the Oregon loss was definitely the bigger concern, which definitely opens my eyes to this conversation. But I think overall, they haven't really shown a reason why they're even this highly rated, I would say. And when you do really look at the opportunities to be upset, it really does come down to a mixture of, I guess, shooting and defense, as well as maybe some other factors. And I don't think that as good as Guard is as a coach, he never really seems to understand differing styles of play. Once again, the Big Ten play is so radically different from most other teams, which is why the Big Ten never really wins in March. And I get it that he has had these moments. I think 2015, that's probably the best example you can really give at any moment for Guard's career as a coach. But this team, it's more of a vibe check, I would say. Like, and it's hard. It No one really thought Kentucky was going to really fall like that. No one really saw Auburn for Arizona 2 years back. I just feel as though, based on the vibes and based on just how I felt with this team this entire year, they've had moments where they just didn't look good at all.
Right.
And they've only recently shot up. I get it, the hot hand can go to one place and never come back. But this team has a ceiling that's not that high. And the floor is a lot lower than I think people think it's going to be.
Yeah.
And it could show. Once again, I don't know what 15 seed can do it, or if they fall a little bit, what 14 seed can do it. But this Wisconsin team feels a little bit too concerning to not be
Right.
put on this
And I
list.
mean, I think it's kind of similar to last year where a lot of times they would fall back on AJ Store and just kind of relied on him to just go and get them a bucket when they needed it. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing this year at times with John Tanji. I think the team this year is a little bit more all around than it was last year. But yeah, that's a team that I don't trust in March. And I like how you did mention Kentucky getting upset last year because I think that's a team we both talked about that we do not, that we definitely think is at a risk of being upset in the first round
I
this
know.
year.
And it's funny. Like,
Yeah,
Kentucky would lose in the first round again, but for completely different reasons, in my
right,
opinion. Last year it was the defense, and this year it's kind of the opposite. They haven't had, like we said before, they don't have a defined point guard. Positions have been a little bit off. It's Pope's first year, and they don't perform well on the road. They're very much a home team, and even
right.
then, Rupp has been a bit of an iffy scenario for them. I think that once again, this team is less likely to be upset than last year, but they're showing these very concerning signals that I think has been shown entirely through SEC play, maybe a little bit through their non-conference play. They haven't had a loss like the UNCW loss that they had last year, which definitely gave me a reason to be concerned about them last
Right.
year, I would say. But if I've known anything about college basketball, is that you can never really tell until you see it. They don't really pass the vibe check for me. They feel just too hectic. And there's only so much chaos you can put in college basketball. There has to be a lot of order for good teams to work, and this team doesn't have that order at all.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I mean, the early stretch of the season, I even talked about it on one of our episodes several months back that I felt Kentucky really did have Final Four upside. We talked about Mark Pope being the coach of the year. Since then, they've kind of gone downwards in how they were trending. Like you just mentioned, I thought maybe Lamont Butler had kind of emerged as their point guard, but even now, I don't think they truly do have a defined lead guard. I know they've missed Jackson Robinson. I don't know if he's back, but I understand that that's definitely a blow to their scoring. But yeah, it's really interesting because, like you mentioned, they've lost in the previous years in the first round for different reasons. I think a lot of that had to fall on Cal and just how, if we're being honest, Calipari isn't a great coach. He's the greatest recruiter of our generation, just not a great coach. We're seeing that at Arkansas. I thought he was going to change. Most people did. He's the same old Cal. But now I think it's kind of falling a little bit more on roster construction, just kind of the inability for, like you mentioned, not having defined roles.
Yeah, no, it's once again very hard to tell otherwise. But the defined roster roles and the fact that there hasn't been a proper leading scorer, or at least a consistent leading scorer, has
Right.
made things concerning. And while typically that does mean a good sign, I think for Kentucky it's a bit of an issue just in the fact that it's not consistent.
Yeah. I
I
mean, who do
think
you
I would
choose to
rather
go to late
have
in games or at the
exactly.
end
I
of
would
the
rather have a scenario where there's more consistency with the players around the leading scorer than
Right.
the leading scorer not be consistent himself, because teams can get by when their leading scorer isn't scoring the most if the surrounding squad can maintain their consistency. The problem with Kentucky is that there'll be a player that scores a lot, but then it's just that player. And I think
Right.
that's the biggest problem I see with Kentucky. And I think it's kind of also an issue with Arizona in a little way. I mean, it's more or less
Definitely.
on Caleb Love. I mean, we know how Arizona's been recently. They're chokers in March. You can say what you want about them, but I think there's definitely a spot for them in this list. I don't know if they get upset the first round. They've been a lot hotter than I would say they've been even last year when they did get a 2 seed. But I think once again, that's kind of a similar issue. I mean, Love we know is supposed to be the main scorer on this team, but beyond that, there's really only so much to give. I mean, Townsend can be great, Delorso can be great. You can get great bench movement, but sometimes these players don't really show the consistency. And when
Right.
Love is not showing consistency, which he really hasn't been at all this season,
Yeah.
it kind of becomes a problem because then you're just going to have an entirely inconsistent team, which that might do it for the Big 12, but it's not going to do it in March. That's
Right.
for sure.
And I know Tommy Lloyd mentioned that he knows his team is at its peak when Caleb Love is playing his best basketball. And he talked about how Arizona needs to get to the point where he know. I mean, the whole country knows Caleb Love is arguably one of the most inconsistent college players ever, where you know he can go out and get 30 on any night, but he can also absolutely just, go 1 for 11 from the floor and just not have a good game by any means. And Tommy Lloyd knows that. And he says for Arizona to be at its best, they need to have the guys around Caleb Love, be consistent enough for when Caleb Love doesn't have when he has a bad game, which is at this point pretty inevitable. It's going to happen at some point. You know it will. They need guys like Carter Bryant, KJ Lewis, like you mentioned, Delorso, Trey Townsend to step up. And there's been certain games this year where they've shown flashes of those guys being able to do so. Especially against BYU, Delorso had a really good game. His first good game in a while, actually. Carter Bryant also was really solid off the bench for them too, and I think they need more of that going forward.
Definitely. And it, once again, I don't really see it. Like, they would more or less pass the vibe check, in my opinion, because they've used the hot hand pretty well. And I understand that their losses haven't been as bad as people are putting them as. Like, the
Right,
BYU loss, I think, is still, like, I mean, that's a controversy in its own right that I don't think it's
right,
worth
right, yeah,
talking about.
definitely.
But if you're going to ask me right now, I don't see them going far. Maybe not first round upsets, but it's very similar to last year where they very much could have won against Clemson. They very easily could have made Elite Eight, Final Four, given their scenario, but they were missing the consistency. And that's really the most thing. That's really the most you can get out of a lot of these teams that we're putting on this list. I think even teams that I don't expect to be first round upsets, but could be teams that don't make it past the second round, like Michigan State and St. John's, which once again, as we've noted earlier in this video, poor shooting.
Right.
Regardless of how good your team is, if you can't shoot well in March, you're just not making it. And those are teams that, once again, could make the Final Four, but if they don't have good shooting, their second round, maybe Sweet 16 exits that we don't really think should be in that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, just in March, you need shot making. If you don't have it, then it's kind of a recipe for disaster. I kind of believe St. John's defensive prowess is enough to get them out of the first weekend. Michigan State, not as much, but I trust both those coaches a lot more than I would say it'd be a team without coaches of that caliber. But yeah, Arizona, I think Arizona's ceiling realistically is probably Sweet 16. Um,
I would say the
but
same.
yeah, but they're definitely capable of being upset in the first round. I don't think they will. I think Caleb Love will show up for a first round game, but after that, I think it starts to get a little sketchy if you're a Wildcat fan.
Definitely. I mean, they've been through a lot. So, if anything much, maybe this is not a 2022 or 2023, but Boyd has to work something out. I feel like he's
Yeah,
too
for
good of a
sure.
coach to not make a Final Four, and this is not a year for him to make the Final Four. I would say, it's a good year. They've done well. Maybe they show us they're wrong, but as of right now, the inconsistency is the most glaring thing about this team, and
Right.
that's all I can say about it too.
Right. I mean, we talk about the inconsistency, and they've only had what, three losses in conference play. But I mean, it's just something that's underlying and is always going to be looming. I think when you have Caleb Love on your basketball team. I know we talked about a few weeks back about how he's been one of the more polarizing players in the sport since he's entered the college ranks. But yeah, it's definitely a team that is treading on thin ice in terms of how far they could end up going in the tournament.